What if the single piece of land that started this entire war is now slowly being strangled to death, and Russia can't stop it? That's not a hypothetical. It's what's happening right now in Crimea, and the signs coming out of the peninsula are unlike anything we've seen since this war began. Officials are quietly evacuating documents, families of military officers are disappearing to the mainland, fuel is being rationed, the lights are going out, and the man who built his entire political legacy on seizing this land is watching it become a burden he can no longer afford to carry. If this is the kind of analysis you've been looking for, real, detailed, no fluff, then subscribe right now and hit that bell. Tap the like button if you want this channel to keep producing work like this, and share this video with someone who thinks they understand this war, because I promise you, most people don't know what's actually happening in Crimea right now. Let's get into it. To understand why Crimea matters so much, you have to go back to where this war truly started. Not February 2022, February 2014. That was when Russian forces, without insignia, without official acknowledgement, moved into Crimea and seized it in a matter of days. It was fast, it was almost bloodless, and it stunned the world. Putin called it a historic correction. He stood before cameras and told Russians that Crimea had finally come home. The crowds cheered. His approval ratings soared. It became the defining moment of his rule. Proof, as he presented it, that Russia was powerful again, and that the West could do nothing to stop it. But Crimea was never just a symbol. It was a military masterstroke. The peninsula juts out into the Black Sea like a fist. Whoever holds it controls the naval approach to southern Ukraine, the mouth of the Sea of Azov, and the commercial shipping lanes that connect Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, based at the port of Sevastopol for over 2 centuries, suddenly became a forward operating base for projecting power across the entire region. Every Russian military operation in southern Ukraine since 2022 has been supplied, supported, and coordinated through Crimea. Take away Crimea, and you don't just take away territory, you collapse Russia's entire southern war machine. That's why Ukraine has been going after it, methodically, systematically, and with growing effectiveness. The campaign has a name. Ukrainian commanders call it the Middle Range Strike Campaign, and it started in earnest in April of this year. The philosophy behind it is deceptively simple. Don't try to take ground you're not ready to hold. Instead, make it impossible for the enemy to hold it themselves. Destroy the logistics, cut the supply lines, kill the infrastructure, turn the fortress into a ruin, and then, when the time is right, walk in. This strategy unfolds in 3 distinct phases, and understanding each one is the key to understanding everything that's happening right now. The first phase is isolation. The goal is to cut Crimea off from Russia, to turn a peninsula into an island, functionally, if not geographically. To do that, you have to understand how Crimea is actually kept alive. There are 2 main supply routes. The first is the land corridor, a roughly 600-kilometer road and rail network running from Rostov in Russia through occupied Ukrainian territory down to the peninsula. The second is the Kerch Bridge, the enormous road and rail crossing that Putin personally opened in 2018 as a symbol of Russia's permanent claim to Crimea. Ukraine has been hitting both simultaneously. The results along the land corridor have been dramatic. According to the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Russian military logistics traffic on that corridor dropped by 71% in just 2 weeks of concentrated strikes. That's not a temporary dip. That's near paralysis. Russia tried protecting its fuel convoys with mobile air defense units riding alongside them. It barely helped. What makes this campaign particularly remarkable is the economics of it. Ukraine's Bober-class drones, the primary weapon being used to strike bridges and supply routes, cost less than $50,000 each. The Storm Shadow cruise missiles Ukraine used for similar strikes in earlier phases of the war cost around $2 million per shot. Ukraine can now deliver the same strategic effect at roughly 1/40th the price. It can sustain this campaign far longer, far more frequently than Russia can sustain the defense against it. The strikes on the bridges connecting Crimea to mainland Ukraine, at Chonhar and Henichesk, have been repeated multiple times. The railway bridges crossing the North Crimea Canal have been hit. In June alone, oil terminals at the ports of Kerch and Kavkaz were heavily damaged. 3 large ferry vessels operating in the Kerch Strait took direct hits and were knocked out of service. And in the first 2 weeks of July, Ukraine struck 136 vessels carrying fuel to Crimea in the Sea of Azov. Many of them were Shadow Fleet tankers, ships operating under false flags to help Russia evade sanctions. They're not immune to naval drones, and that brings us to perhaps the most extraordinary military development of this entire war, Ukraine's sea drones. These unmanned surface vessels have rewritten the rules of naval warfare in the Black Sea. They are relatively cheap, they are small and fast, and they have accomplished what no one predicted at the start of this conflict. Russia's Black Sea Fleet A force that once projected power across an entire sea has been driven out of Sevastopol, forced to retreat to the port of Novorossiysk, far to the east. And even there, it isn't safe. On July 14th, a Ukrainian naval drone struck and sank a Russian FSB border patrol vessel called the Izumrud off the Novorossiysk coast. The ship wasn't just any target. It was reportedly involved in the 2018 incident where Russia illegally seized Ukrainian naval boats in the Kerch Strait. Ukraine sent it to the bottom of the sea and, in doing so, closed a chapter that had been left open for 6 years. The newer generations of these drones are even more capable. They can now launch surface-to-air missiles. They can target and shoot down Russian combat aircraft. These are not improvised weapons anymore. They are purpose-built systems that have already forced the most significant withdrawal of a Russian naval force since World War II. With a €70 billion NATO support package pledged at the 2026 Ankara summit, specifically earmarked for Ukraine, this arsenal is only going to grow. Phase 1 is working. And the evidence isn't just on the battlefield, it's in what's happening to ordinary life in Crimea. Here's something worth stopping on for a second. Because if you've made it this far, you're clearly paying attention. I want you to do one thing before we continue. Go to the comments right now and tell me, do you think Russia will withdraw from Crimea voluntarily, or will it fight to the last? Drop your prediction. I read everything posted there, and the most interesting takes will get featured in the next video. Now let's get to the part that tells you just how much pressure Russia is actually under. Phase 2 of the campaign is about making Crimea unlivable as a military platform. Not just difficult, genuinely unsustainable, and the evidence that it's working is now coming from inside the occupation administration itself. On the night of July 15th, a massive drone strike plunged the port city of Kerch into complete darkness. That alone was significant, but what happened next showed just how fragile Crimea's infrastructure has become. When the power failed, the water, pumping stations that pressurized the supply network went offline with it. Within hours, water supply was cut off across 9 districts, not just in Kerch, but in Bakhchisarai, Armyansk, Saki, Feodosia, and others. One strike, cascading failures across the entire peninsula. The night before that strike, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, working alongside local resistance units, hit the Balaklava thermal power plant in Sevastopol using jet-powered kamikaze drones. They specifically targeted the main turbine hall, the cooling system of the primary gas turbine. Repair estimates range from 2 to 5 months. This one plant, along with the Tavriiska facility in Simferopol, supplied approximately 90% of Crimea's electricity needs. Both have now been struck. In late June, additional strikes hit the power plant in Simferopol and the main electrical substation in Sevastopol. At the start of July, attacks on the Saki and Hvardiska air bases resulted in roughly 7 Russian combat aircraft damaged or destroyed, along with hangars housing Shahed drone stockpiles. The occupation administration halted civilian fuel sales entirely, reserving what remained for military and government use. Residents of Sevastopol were rationed to 20 liters of gasoline per week. The tourism season, once one of Crimea's primary economic lifelines and a major propaganda showcase for Putin, was essentially canceled. Summer camps shut down. 80% of hotel reservations were abandoned. And then came the internal signals that cut through all the propaganda. In early July, the pro-Ukrainian partisan network known as Atesh reported something remarkable. Occupation administrations in Kerch and Feodosia received an urgent directive from Moscow ordering that all valuable documents and technical equipment be prepared for evacuation by a specific deadline. The order wasn't limited to a single city. It had been transmitted across multiple occupation units throughout the peninsula. Shortly after the directive went out, several high-ranking officials with privileged access to Crimea's scarce fuel supply suddenly took medical leave. They crossed to the Russian mainland. At a moment when ordinary Crimean residents were struggling to find gasoline at any price, the people with access to fuel were the first ones using it to leave. Black Sea Fleet officers had reportedly already begun quietly relocating their families to Novorossiysk without waiting for official orders. Atesh summarized the situation with brutal clarity. While ordinary people were being told to stay calm, the occupation structures were already building escape routes for themselves. The head of Russia's occupation administration in Crimea has now publicly admitted, in his own words, that distributing electricity evenly across the peninsula is no longer possible. That is not a statement a regional governor makes when things are under control. That is a man telling you, in the most careful language available to him, that the system is failing. For Putin, this is not just a military problem. It is a personal catastrophe in slow motion. Crimea was the jewel of his reign. It was the moment he proved to Russians and to the world that he could take what he wanted and face no real consequence. Every subsequent military decision, the Donbass in 2014, Syria, the full invasion in 2022, was built on the confidence that Crimea had generated. It was the foundation of the myth, And myths, once they start cracking, tend to shatter. Ukrainian military intelligence has stated plainly that the current campaign's goal is not an immediate ground offensive. It is to make the occupation expensive, exhausting, and ultimately untenable. And according to retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who has been analyzing this war closely, that approach is the correct one. In his assessment, as long as Russia holds Crimea, Ukraine cannot be genuinely free in the Black Sea. And without Black Sea freedom, this war cannot produce a lasting peace. Crimea's status isn't a Ukrainian issue, it's a European one, because the Black Sea connects to Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, all NATO members. What happens in those waters sends ripples through the alliance's entire southeastern flank. That's why NATO's 2026 Ankara summit explicitly addressed Black Sea security as a top priority for the alliance's southern axis. The €70 billion support commitment wasn't just about keeping Ukraine in the fight. It was a statement that the West has accepted the logic that Crimea's future is a shared Western concern. Now, let's be honest about what's hard, because any serious analysis has to be. The Kerch Bridge is still standing, and that matters enormously. Russia has turned the area around that bridge into one of the most heavily defended positions in the entire war. Multiple S-400 batteries, Panzer systems, Buk missile launchers, and even Russia's advanced S-500 have been deployed in overlapping layers to protect it. Steel towers 30 meters high have been erected on Tuzla Island with air defense systems mounted on top specifically to expand radar coverage. Below the waterline, sunken barges, steel nets, naval mines, and cable barriers have been stretched across the strait. There's a single narrow transit channel left, and it is watched constantly. Ukraine has struck the bridge before, in 2022, 2023, and 2025. The 2025 attack reportedly involved approximately 1,000 kilograms of underwater explosives. The strikes caused serious damage, but serious damage isn't the same as permanent destruction. Each attack requires penetrating the same multi-layered defense system. Each attack burns through precision weapons that are limited in supply and could be used elsewhere. And Russia repairs faster than most observers expected. Russia has also demonstrated real adaptability in its logistics. When bridges get hit, pontoon crossings appear. Ferry capacity gets expanded. Moscow has even begun constructing a new railway line running from Rostov through occupied territory into Crimea, a backup corridor designed specifically to survive strikes on the existing routes. For every supply line Ukraine cuts, Russia is engineering an alternative. It's slower, it's more expensive, it's less efficient, but it exists. The ground offensive, Phase 3, remains a distant prospect. The land approach to Crimea from Ukrainian-controlled territory runs through the Isthmus of Perekop, a strip of land between 5 and 7 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. On one side, the Black Sea. On the other, a vast, shallow salt marsh called the Sivash, known locally as the Putrid Sea. It is one of the most defensible natural choke points in Europe. Russia has been fortifying it since 2014 with trenches, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth concrete barriers, and dense minefields. A frontal assault through that corridor, even against a weakened defender, would be extraordinarily costly, which is why the three-phase plan only works if Phase 2 achieves enough. If Crimea becomes genuinely unsustainable, if the cost of holding it outweighs any strategic or symbolic benefit, then Russia may do what it did in Kherson in 2022. It may simply withdraw, absorbing the humiliation quietly rather than defending a position it can no longer supply. That scenario, if it materializes, would be the most consequential moment of this entire war, not because of the territory, because of what Crimea means to Putin's story about himself and about Russia. Losing Crimea would not be a battlefield setback. It would be the destruction of a founding myth. The moment that started his imperial revival would become the moment that ended it. The domestic political consequences of that, in a country where the narrative of strength and restoration has been the primary justification for everything, are genuinely unknowable. Senior Ukrainian military figures have said openly that the fall of Crimea would not just be a military defeat for Russia, it would be the beginning of the end of the Putin era. There is also the nuclear question, and it deserves an honest answer. Some Russian generals and officials have suggested that losing Crimea could trigger extreme responses. But Western analysts and intelligence assessments are largely consistent on this point. Russia would consider nuclear use only if the survival of the regime itself were directly threatened. A fuel shortage and a collapsed tourism season don't meet that threshold. Putin has issued nuclear threats throughout this war, explicitly, repeatedly, including statements that he was not bluffing. And yet, when Ukraine retook Kherson, when drones struck the Black Sea Fleet, when Crimea itself was hit, the threatened retaliation never came. He backed down quietly, every time. The threat is real enough to take seriously. It is not real enough to treat as inevitable. What is certain is this: the strategy Ukraine is executing right now, grinding, systematic, economically asymmetric, is producing results that no one in Moscow expected and that Putin cannot easily reverse. The isolation of Crimea is not complete, but it is advancing. The infrastructure of the peninsula is not destroyed, but it is degrading. The morale of the occupation apparatus is not broken, but the people at the top are already planning their exits. Crimea is not free yet, but it is no longer the fortress Putin thought he built. It is becoming something else. A drain, a liability, a symbol of a strategy that assumed the world would eventually accept what Russia had taken and move on. The world did not move on. Ukraine did not move on. And now, piece by piece, strike by strike, the foundation that Putin laid in 2014 is being pulled apart. Whether Russia chooses to defend what remains at catastrophic cost or quietly retreat and absorb the political consequences, one thing is already clear. The story Putin told about Crimea, that it was permanent, that it was secure, that it was proof of his power, is no longer credible. And once the story breaks, what's left is just a problem without a solution. That is where we are right now. Phase 2 has begun. The lights are going out. The officials are leaving. The documents are packed. And somewhere in Moscow, people who built their careers on the assumption that Crimea was settled forever are beginning to understand that nothing about this is settled. History has a way of moving faster than empires expect. And in Crimea, right now, it is moving. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what's actually at stake in this war, then here's my ask. Not just a like, not just a subscribe, but something bigger. Send this to one person who you think is only getting surface level news on Ukraine. One share from you reaches someone who might genuinely need this analysis. That's how independent channels like this survive and grow. Share it, stay subscribed, and I'll see you in the next one.